Thank you very much for being here today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here speaking about my research, especially since I'm such a new researcher. I've only just handed in my PhD. Thanks to Olga and Kim for inviting me. So I'm going to ask really politely if you wouldn't mind hitting the keyboard to flick right for me when I need a slide change. So I'll just give you like a little like that when I need a slide change. So perfect. Yeah, let's go straight to the next slide while we're here. Brilliant. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the background to the research and the methods and the sample, and then I'm going to jump to findings, because that's really all anyone cares about. It's the most exciting part, and hopefully there'll be lots of interesting questions and input from you as well, because I'd love to hear what you think in this area. So my background actually isn't academia, social sciences at all. I used to be a journalist, and as a trained qualified journalist in this country, I'm one of the few people that knows about media law and ethics. Has anyone in this room had media law training before? Just so I just know. Okay. So to qualify as a journalist, you have to have a 3-hour unseen exam to prove you know about media laws. There are certain things that if I said them on the radio or live on television, I could actually go to prison for. That's how important this stuff is to learn. So that's why I got interested first in media law and ethics, working as a journalist. What I thought was quite strange is that a lot of the laws that we have to learn as journalists that apply to our broadcasts, publications, communications, also apply to all of you. Anybody using the internet, anybody putting stuff on YouTube, anybody posting content online, even your private communications, those same laws apply to you as they do to me, and yet I've had training on them and none of you have. You may also know, some of you are legal scholars, about this thing called ignorance is not a defence, right? So that's another reason why I thought it was a bit strange that ignorance is not a defence, but we're not taught about the certain laws that apply to communications and publishing. So I designed basically a basic beginner's guide to media law, and it was around 2013 that this happened. Does anyone remember this story? Recognise it? Paris Brown. Okay, we've got a couple of people nodding. So Paris Brown was all set to be the first youth police and crime commissioner. When we elected our police and crime commissioners back in 2013, down in Kent, Anne Barnes said, I want a youth police commissioner, because I think it's important that young people have a say in policing. And Paris Brown was 17 years old at the time. She got the job, and then just as she was about to start this very high profile, prestigious job, there was a double page spread in a national newspaper shaming her for all of her tweets that she'd sent on an account that she'd had, I think, between the age of about 12 and 17. And some of what she'd said was quite appalling. I think we can probably all agree on that. However, I felt very mixed feelings about her as a 17-year-old, which, according to the UN, would still make her a child, being very publicly shamed in this way when we don't teach young people as standard about media and communications law. So that's why I designed basically social media law and ethics, also called online media law. So there's my Twitter handle. And I went into schools and I started teaching young people about these laws. We were very lucky to get a funding grant from our local police and crime commissioner down in Surrey, and I collaborated with a local radio station, Eagle Radio, to deliver the workshops. And I basically had to stop being a journalist, because in the first year we got enough funding to go. I single-handedly went into 45 schools and trained over 9,000 young people on social media law and ethics. That was then recommissioned for a following 3 years. Last year, in 2016-2017, my training reached 15,500 young people aged between 8 and 18 years old. And we cover all the basics, which I'm going to go through the law, which laws we cover in a sec, but it's criminal and civil law. And off the back of that, I was given a scholarship to come and do a PhD researching young people's perspectives of social media, crime and policing. So next slide. Thank you. So this is just a little overview for some of you who are not aware about some of the criminal legal frameworks that I'm educating young people about. So as you can see there, things like online threats, harassing, stalking behaviour. We've got a load of legislation there. Some of you probably already aware, we have a bit of a jigsaw approach to kind of different laws and how we apply them to certain behaviours. As you can see, there's a whole load of different legislation that can be applied to the same kinds of behaviour, so there's a bit of a judgment happening there. And So we cover online threats and abuse, harassment. I educate them about indecent image sharing, also known as sexting, revenge porn as it's known, particularly important for under 18s, learn about the law about that. We also look at grossly offensive, malicious communications, and also material intended to stir up hatred as well, so online hate speech. And that's just the criminal legal framework. In addition, we also try to cover things like libel, defamation law, privacy, and copyright as well. Now, just a quick show of hands in the room. Anyone know at what age you're held criminally responsible? Anyone not sure? I'm going to count down. I like this game. I'm just going to count down from 18, and I'd like you to put your hand up when I get to the age that you think you can be held criminally responsible, i.e. arrested, prosecuted and incarcerated for committing a crime in England and Wales. So hands up if you think it's 17. 16? Okay. 15? 14? 13? 12? 11? 10? Yeah, most of you have got it right. We're in the right audience. So yeah, 10 years old, you can be held criminally responsible in England and Wales. We've got the lowest age of criminal responsibility in Europe. And this is also why I designed this training, because I was like, by the time you get to secondary school, basically, you need to be aware of criminal legislation surrounding social media. So that's why I do what I do. As far as I'm aware, there are not many studies out there that actually investigate public perceptions of the law. There's even fewer that actually talk to children about what their perceptions of the law are. And as far as I'm aware, fewer still, if any, that focus on social media and online offending. So that's where I'm trying to sit in terms of my contribution to knowledge. Thanks. So, quick overview of my sample of methods for my research. I went into 2 large state schools. I did 9 classes that were 1 hour each. So I've done ethnographic methods, so it's participant observation. And also I took handwritten notes in the field of verbatim quotations from young people. I worked with years 7 to 13, so that's ages 11 up to 18 years old. I had about 20 pupils per class, total of 184 participants. And what I did is I put them into small groups for discussion, and I gave out 12 stimuli examples of fictional online posts. So the idea was to generate some discussion, and to help sort of nail down even more their perceptions of law, I gave them 4 categories of risk, so kind of like a traffic light system. So red if they thought it was something that had a criminal risk, orange if they thought it was something that had a civil risk, so something they could get sued for, yellow if they thought it had a reputation risk, something like that, or a social risk, not something you get arrested or sued for, but still not a good idea, and green if they thought it was fine. So that's basically how the methods worked. I handed out these examples of online posts and wrote down what the young people said in terms of how risky they thought it was and why. So if we jump to the next slide, just to give you, this is a kind of an idea of my raw data in its original form. So that at the top there is one example of a post that I gave out, quite a good one for online misogyny. So obviously I can't give out examples of indecent images of children. So what I do is I mock up a tweet here that says, you've got to watch this video of Alice, what a massive slut, and then it's obviously a link to a video. What I do then is I note down what year group it was, which example it was, so they're all labelled A to L, the total number of participants, how many male and female, and I'm aware that observing gender is hugely problematic, particularly in this day and age. However, in light of the gendered nature of a lot of these offences, I thought it was important to make note if there was a difference in terms of perceptions of risk amongst gender. So so I did observe gender to try and get a sense of that. I noted down how many reds, oranges, yellows and greens were allocated or mentioned by each group. And then you can see on the right, I wrote verbatim quotation notes of exactly what the young people said. So you can see there some of the examples of what some of the young people were saying in response to this particular post. So I'm now going to go straight to the findings because I think they're the most interesting part. Great, I'm going to need to do lots of clicking here, sorry for that. So lots of bullet points. So some of my main findings. 1, age does matter. Generally speaking, the younger students gave everything higher risk ratings. And as they got older, as they hit sort of sixth form age, they're much more likely to use the lower ranking categories. And this actually contradicts a lot of what the literature says. The literature says we get more risk aware and more risk averse as we get older. But actually these findings kind of show the opposite. And I think it's quite interesting. My theory is that teenagers learn how to justify or excuse certain types of behaviour as they get older. Okay, next one, thank you. Probably my main finding was there's absolutely no consensus in terms of risk, perceptions of risk, particularly around the example of sharing indecent images of children, that sort of revenge porn mock-up that I just showed you there. That was the one that I thought would have the most criminal consensus of risk, right? Because there's been so much stuff in schools by police and other authorities saying, look, underage sexting is a problem, do not share indecent images. I thought, well, that's going to be the one that's going to be the most consensus in terms of risk. It actually had the least consensus. It was given 52 different category mentions across all 4 of those categories by young people. It was the most contested one overall. Interestingly, in addition to that, I noticed that in young people's discussions, there was almost a bit of an acceptance of everybody having a different perspective as well. There didn't seem to be this fighting out of, well, who's actually right? There was definitely a feeling of subjectivity being embraced, possibly even relativism, to the extent that, well, everybody's allowed their own view, everyone's allowed their own perspective. There's not a huge amount of conflict in terms of, well, who actually got it right and who didn't. It's kind of like everyone's allowed their view, right? So that was quite interesting. The next point, so which one did have the most criminal risk consensus? Some of you might be familiar with the Twitter joke tweet by Paul Chambers. Some of you are nodding and smiling. Right, so Paul Chambers a few years ago put a tweet up saying, oh, if this airport doesn't sort itself out, I'm going to blow it sky high on Twitter. Not a very sensible idea. He was initially found guilty of sending a threatening communication, a menacing communication, but he was cleared in the end. He managed to appeal that decision. So interesting that Paul Chambers was cleared. So I mocked up almost like a copy of what Paul Chambers had sent. And that was the one that all the kids thought was most risky, most criminally risky. And the word terrorism and terror threat was mentioned by every single group that I showed this tweet to. So there's a perception actually of the law is not in line with what actually the verdict was on that particular case, which is quite interesting. Saying and doing dichotomy. So a lot of existing research points out that young people don't see a distinction between their online and their offline lives and worlds, right? And I do think that is true. However, a lot of young people would say in their responses, well, it's just saying that. It's just saying something. It's not doing anything. And there's a real sense of this saying versus doing dichotomy. And so it suggests that on some level, online publication of speech is not seen as an act in itself. It's very much seen as separate to doing something, saying something and doing something, which was strange. So I looked as well at what kind of legal terminology and labels were used and applied to these tweets. The labels, so I had 2 examples that were racist, and they were quite frequently, but not unanimously, recognised as being racist and labelled as racist. Homophobic examples, less so. And then when it came to sexist and misogynistic content, not a single participant out of the 189 of them mentioned something being sexist or something being misogynistic, which to me suggests the words are perhaps not even in their vocabulary. So that was quite interesting. There was quite a lot of what I would call victim responsibilization rhetoric. So that's the idea that victims are somehow responsible for their victimization. And that might be because of something they'd done before the online post. For example, well, if Alice agreed to be in that video, she's made her bed, she's got to lie in it, it's her fault kind of thing. Or even after a post has been made. So there was one example that was sort of like homophobic bullying or taunting. And a lot of young people said, oh, well, Peter, this sort of subject of this tweet, Peter should just choose not to be offended. If he is gay, he should just be like, yeah, so what, and not be offended by it. So there's quite a lot of victim responsibilization kind of rhetoric going on in terms of victims taking responsibility for being offended or being at risk. There was also a lot of young people so I asked them very specifically, kind of coded, what did they think the consequences would be for an imagined sender who posted this kind of material? And it was very common that there was a perception of no consequences. Even if there was a clear moral judgment made, as in, that's disgusting, that's awful, that's really bad, oh, you shouldn't do that. When I said, well, what do you think would happen? Quite often it was nothing. So there's this perception of a lack of policing or an excessive tolerance of this kind of material online. So that was quite worrying. Those of you who are familiar with criminology might have heard of this thing called techniques of neutralisation. These are the ways in which offending or deviant behaviour can be neutralised in order that people don't feel bad about it. So it's kind of like excuses for bad behaviour, if you like. And these were commonly employed by young people for an imagined sender. Bearing in mind this is all hypothetical. Sometimes they would say, well, it might not be their fault because of this, so that's denial of responsibility. Or, oh, well, it's not really doing any harm. That's what another technique we call denial of injury. Quite a lot of techniques used to justify or neutralise a sender for sending this content. The other thing that was very, very common was there is an awareness of sexual offending amongst young people, particularly in the digital age as well, and was often brought up in discussion by young people unprompted by me. So there was one example that I gave them, was meant to indicate a threat of violence. Quite a lot of the young people thought that it indicated a threat of sexual violence, which was not what I intended, bearing in mind I mocked it up. But they would actually bring that to the conversation themselves and start a discussion. And what I was quite surprised by is that young people seem very competent, if not confident, having discussions about sexual offending. But I get the impression that they're not often able to have those conversations normally in school or with family or whatever, because there did seem to be a lot of then questions that were sparked off by that. And then the final point, which relates to actually one of the example posts that I gave them, was an allegation of a teacher-student relationship, right? So that is something that basically should be flagged up as a disclosure safeguarding issue, even if it was put up as a joke. However, almost unanimously, the young people thought that it would be risky to share that information with anyone. And that includes, even if they recognised that that was a problematic relationship or even a criminal relationship, an abusive relationship, there was still this unanimous feeling that it's not your business to post that, you shouldn't be telling anyone about that. There was even a sense of, well, you could get the student into trouble if you told people about that. So there's some really, really serious safeguarding concerns raised by that. And sadly, not a single one of my young participants suggested what might be a proper way to report or disclose that issue as well. So recommendations, I'm going to go through these quite quickly. Obviously, I do social media law and ethics in school. I think this should be on the curriculum. I'm not going to make any bones about it. I think we need to have better public legal education, and that includes for social media. We need to make sure there is a human rights framework to that conversation as well. So it's not just about risks, it's about rights as well. And also, I think critical criminology. One of the lovely things about teaching law is I can almost sort of demoralize myself and say, well, you might think it's a bit silly. You know, if a young person says to me, oh, that's ridiculous, why is it 18 for sending naked pictures, but the age of consent is 16? And it allows you to say, well, I didn't come up with these laws, I'm just here to tell you about them, right? And I do think that critical approach to criminology, young people have to understand the law, but also they might actually have perspectives on it and how it can be improved as well. So I think that's important. We need much more work on sex and relationships education and on safeguarding disclosure processes. There's still too much victim blaming going on there. Again, leading on from that, we need to actively challenge victim blaming rhetoric across the media, culture and policing, because that's still a problem. We do need to address this perceived tolerance of illegal material online and in digital spaces, because I think that's contributing to the perception that it's not very risky to post it. I think it's very important that we use the correct terminology for offending behaviours. So, you know, I don't particularly like this phrase, cyberbullying, because it's a bit vague to me. How do you know whether it's somebody just being a bit mean or somebody that's actually committing a criminal offence? So I think we should call harassment, harassment, call assault, assault, etc. We do need better consultation and research with young people about the policies that are going to affect them. I think it's important their perspectives are fed into these debates. Finally, and probably most importantly, lots of people come up to me and say, well, obviously young people don't know anything about social media law. And I said, well, obviously people don't know anything about social media law. I don't know whether it actually has anything to do with age. Most interesting thing for me would be to find out if these findings would be any different if I had an adult sample. I'm not sure they would be. I actually think the problem is nobody knows about these laws. It's not just kids. But yeah, that pretty much wraps it up. Please do get in touch with me. My web address is there, plus my Twitter. I do resources, consultancy and training on young people and social media law and ethics. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh no, I don't have any slides.
Very sensible.
I wish I had some now.